Welcome to Silly, Sexy, and Sadistic History. I'm Rose, and we're about to get weird with history. Today's episode is going to be on Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, and holy shit, it's going to be a wild ride of some really silly sexuality, and even a little bit of sadism as well. Please do be forewarned, there will definitely be some instances of sexual violence within this podcast. I will probably maintain my aggressively sarcastic tone. Please don't take that as me belittling the experience of sexual violence. It's just how I deal with terrible things. I'll be using the name Dionysus throughout this podcast because that's how he's commonly known today and seems to be the most common name used to describe him in the source material, but he had many other names, including Carmabrostian, god of many joys, Dimorphos, god of two forms, Dithyrambos, god of two births, Erykipios, the androgynous god, Philopagmos, the lover of satyrs, Phytalmios, the god of growth, Agathosdaimon, the good demon, Dionysius, raging god, Zagreus, horned or hunting god, and my favorite, Phallus Phanes, the winged phallus. I want you all to appreciate how long it took me to figure out how I was going to pronounce all those ridiculous Greek names. It is pretty common for Westerners to learn a bit of Greek mythology, but it's always told from the perspective of, oh, this is a really old story that people have told each other for ancient times. But mythology is so much more than that. It was the basis of a whole religion. I mean, the stories of Greek mythology are an oral version of the Bible for that religion. So I wanted to focus more on telling a Greek myth from that perspective. So we're going to get over some historical context, what the world was like at the time people were actually worshipping Dionysus, then get into the myths that weren't myths, they were truth to the people who were celebrating them, and then actually go over some of the rituals that were used to worship Dionysus. So people were into Dionysus for a fucking long time. Some scholars have argued that he was a later addition to the Greek pantheon because he's got a weird origin story that involves lots of travel. But that does not actually seem to be the case, as his name appears on some tablets from about 3,500 years ago. So some scholars argue that like 2,500 years ago is about when he showed up in the Greek pantheon, but like his name is on Mycenaean tablets that are 3,500 years old. So my bet's on the older date. For comparison, the first records of Zeus, who's supposedly Dionysus' daddy, also came from around this time. And then, how late was he worshipped? Well, up until 700 CE, so 700 Common Era, so 1,300 years ago, people who were Christians still celebrated Dionysus at their wine festivals, much to the chagrin of the Catholic Church. But wine makes you want to celebrate, and Dionysus is how you celebrate wine. So Dionysus showed up in Greece around 3,500 years ago. And this is really early in Greek history. It's basically the beginning of Greek history. The Mycenaeans were the first Greek-speaking cultural Greek people recognized by historians. So he's definitely an OG. But he didn't get super popular until the mystery cults that really emphasized his worship in the classical and Hellenistic eras, which were like 2,500 years ago to 2,000 years ago. And these mystery cults, of which Dionysus was a major part of, were really centered on the afterlife and resurrection and the ability of the soul to move from body to body after death or into different species. It was pretty wild. And since I have the best sources for how Dionysus was worshipped during the classical era, so that period of like 2,500 years ago to 2,200 years ago, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So if we think about that time period, that's when like Athens ruled over all of Greece. So the Parthenon and all the beautiful big Greek temples and whatnot, that's what a lot of, like that's this time period. That's what we're talking about here. So that birth of democracy and like all those philosophers, Diogenes and Plato, that were all emphasizing the participation in politics and, everyone needs to find the best truth and logic, and really a value of knowledge was super important. So it makes sense that these mystery cults were very important at this time because everyone wanted to find out what happened to your soul when you died. Everyone wanted to know and have control over it. So yes, democracy was a big deal, and the rights of the individual were kind of a big deal right now as well. But you gotta kind of take that with a grain of salt, because the only people that really mattered in Athens were citizens. So that's a man of age who can and will fight for Athens, and so it was a pretty restrictive club. It was very much a patriarchal society. Men held all the political power and all of the power over their families. But this is where it gets a little interesting with Dionysus, is women were a very important part of his religion and his worship, so they actually did manage to have some power within that context, which is pretty great. And the importance of women to Dionysus is really evident in his mythology. So that's where we're going to next. And I hope y'all are ready for the wildest fucking ride, because this story is, well, you'll see. So the story of Dionysus has been told for 3,500 years. So understandably, there's a couple different versions. I read at least 5, plus the one I already had in my brain that I learned in school. So I did my best to try to make a cohesive story out of those different versions. So hopefully it kind of makes sense, although it definitely doesn't at all make sense. So Zeus is Dionysus's dad. So that, big head of the Greek pantheon, Zeus. And Zeus was, he was fucking man whore. He had a wife, but he liked to fuck literally everybody else. And that's kind of what all of Greek mythology is about. His bastard children. So like Hercules. Not Hercules, we're talking about Greece. It's Hercules. Hercules was Roman. Thank you, Disney, for confusing everyone with that. So like much of Greek mythology, Dionysus' story starts out with Zeus sticking his dick somewhere he shouldn't have. And that somewhere would be his own daughter, Persephone. And Persephone was the goddess of growing things and spring, but also of the underworld, as she was the wife of Hades. And it was unclear to me whether Zeus fucked his daughter/brother's wife before or after they got married. But it's pretty fucking twisted either way. And Persephone's mother was also Zeus's sister, and so was Zeus's wife. What a love triangle that is. Really, it's more like a love decahedron or some fucking, I don't even know. There's too many people involved. But anyway, Zeus fucked his niece daughter, Persephone, and she gave birth to Dionysus, who was hella powerful, just straight out of the womb, crawled right up on Zeus's throne and was like, yeah, bitch, I'm next. So he was Zeus's heir apparent. Hera, Zeus's wife, who apparently got very little of his attention, was pretty envious that Zeus had his heir with another woman, who was also the bastard child from fucking Hera's sister, too, and who was his own sister, and I don't even know how to make this story make sense. Anyway, Hera, Zeus's wife, jealous, so she calls upon the Titans, and Hera was like, this baby's too strong, he's gonna end the world as we know it, and the Titans were like, totally. So they just chopped little tiny baby Dionysus up in little bits. Zeus was a fan of Dionysus. He was like, yeah, this is my little man. So he was hella pissed, and he sent all the Titans back down to Tartarus. So like the hell of Hades. So like Hades is just the underworld. It's not all burning flames and dying torture. There's just one part of it that's like that, and that's Tartarus. But wait, what the fuck happened to baby dead Dionysus then? Well, have no fear. Zeus had a backup plan. He had this mortal priestess, Semele, back on Earth, who he'd been fucking. Maybe in the form of a snake, and he gave her some of Dionysus's little bits in a soup, and the combo of magic god sperm and baby god bits meant that Semele could give birth to Dionysus again. But oh, the story does not end here. Hera is still really not wanting Dionysus to be a thing, and she loved to take her frustration with the fact that her husband constantly cheated on her by punishing the women that he cheated on her with, because, it's their fault that they're being raped by a god. So Hera went up to Semele disguised as a little old harmless woman and tried to convince her that there was no way that she was going to be the mother of a child conceived with a god. So she was basically like, you gotta convince Zeus to show you his true form, because it's not real. Like, you did not get fucked by a god. That doesn't happen to real people. And she bought this for some reason. And also, if a god shows their true form to a mortal in Greek mythology, it just, evaporates them on the spot. Like, they're just dead. Like, people can't look at gods. So then the next time that Semele sees Zeus, she just begs him to show him her true form and prove that she's really pregnant with the child of a god. And, Zeus doesn't want to. He doesn't want to kill the mother of his unborn child. But he does anyway? He's like, I'll just show her a little bit of my true form. It'll be fine. Well, it's not fine. She dies. And Zeus is like, fuck's sake. Goddamn, I just want this baby. So he just rips Dionysus' little fetus out of Semele's body and sews it into his own thigh. He's like, fuck it, I'll just gestate this little guy myself. And a couple months later, Zeus goes to the island of Nysa, maybe part of the Dionysus. That might be where that name comes from. But it's like, it's a pretty far away island, not a Greek island. It's one of those Dionysus is a traveler, he's a stranger from far away kind of tropes. But yeah, he just goes to Nysa and he's like, oh, look, a baby! And he rips him out of his lake and gives him to some sea nymphs to protect him from Hera. Like, oh, he's hidden on this faraway island, it'll be fine. So Dionysus basically spends the rest of his adolescence hiding from Hera. So he's raised by those nymphs on Nysa, and then he went and he hung out with some other nymphs, and he hung out with this centaur that like trained him how to be super cool and badass. And he might have also been raised as a girl for a while. So like, there's no magical son of Zeus here, this is just some little girl. And it's kind of interesting here to look back on that like list of names I rattled off at the beginning of the episode. So there's Erykipios, the androgynous god. So you can kind of see that here already. There's an example of Dionysus being portrayed as, you know, not entirely masculine, not raised entirely masculine either. But anyway, Dionysus had grown up. He was ready to take his place in the world, and he figured out the fucking invaluable magic of making wine. Unfortunately, this success attracted the attention of Hera again, and she struck him with madness so that he wandered the world for a while. You know, again, that idea of Dionysus is a stranger from another land because Hera made him wander around. But what's cool is while he was wandering around, he was like, hey world, this is how you make wine. And that's awesome. So joke's on you, Hera. Really, you helped out everyone. After a while of wandering around, giving the world the gift of wine, Rhea, the mother of all the Olympian gods, so like Zeus's mom, Dionysus' grandma, finds Dionysus and is like, fucking Hera, she's the worst. And cures Dionysus of his madness and teaches Dionysus the mystery cult rituals, which will later be used to worship him. And then he spends some more time wandering around the world teaching people how to worship in the mystery cults. So again, that's that religion focused on resurrection and the transience of the soul and the afterlife and how spirits can go back and forth from the afterlife. So eventually Dionysus gets back to Greece and is like, hey, Greek people, check out this cool religion that my grandma taught me. But then in Greece, he's like, oh man, I miss my mom. She was a cool lady. And then Dionysus is like, shit, I miss both my moms. That cool underworld goddess one and the human one. Maybe I'll just go down to the underworld and see what's up. Try to resurrect my mom. Learned all about that mystery cult shit, so I could probably figure it out. So Dionysus goes on a katabasis, which is a fancy Greek word for vacation in the underworld. But how does one find the underworld? Well, Dionysus didn't know, so he was wandering around and the shepherd was like, hey man, I know how to get to the underworld. It's in the middle of this practically bottomless lake. And Dionysus is like, that's cool. Damn, I don't have a boat. And the shepherd's like, hey man, I got a boat, but if you want me to help you out, you gotta fuck me when you get back from the underworld. And Dionysus is a Greek man, and Greek men had absolutely nothing against homosexuality. It was pretty commonplace to have homosexual acts, so he was like, hell yeah, that sounds like a great deal. We'll talk when I get back. Also, side note, take that, people against sex work, because even the gods had no shame in selling their bodies. None of the myth versions actually talk about Dionysus checking up on Persephone, his first mom, but you know, I'd like to think he stopped in and said hi. Because, you know, he's in our neighborhood. But he does find his mom, Semele, and he's like, let's go, Mom. I'm going to bring you back to life. Not only that, I'm going to make sure you're a goddess when we get there. But they have one more obstacle to face. To get out of the underworld, you have to pass Cerberus. So that big three-headed dog. Think Fluffy from Harry Potter. But have no fear. Dionysus' half-brother, Hercules, had no problem just helping him out. He just restrains Cerberus, and Dionysus just goes right back to the world of living with Semele, who, once topside, is renamed Theone, and Zeus raises her to the status of an Olympian goddess, and her job is to preside over the revelric worship of Dionysus. So, you know, resurrection, raising to a goddess, no big deal, whatever. However, Dionysus does have to pay a price for saving his mother, and that is apparently an effeminate demeanor. So he's often depicted with long hair, wearing lady clothes. He's even sometimes just straight up depicted as a woman. So this emergence from the underworld also counts as another example of like a rebirth of Dionysus. So you have his original birth from Persephone, his second kind of birth ripped out of the womb of Semele, the third kind of birth from Zeus's thigh, and now we have a reemergence from the underworld, and that's a fourth one. So it's like places Dionysus between life and death as a bridge or a portal between the two, which is why he's so important to these mystery cults that are very focused on exactly that issue. The soul going back and forth from the underworld, what happens afterward, what can happen next. But wait, what happened to our friend the shepherd? Doesn't Dionysus still have to make good on his deal? Well, he would have, but the shepherd was dead when Dionysus got back. But Dionysus, always a man of his word, finds that shepherd's gravesite, and he makes a wooden phallus out of a fig tree. And, well, I'm sure you can piece together the rest. I add this because it's an interesting bit, and it offers an explanation for why figwood phalluses were used as ritual objects in the mystery cults, but there's no ancient sources that say explicitly this. There is some allusions to it, but no, like, yep, that's what happened. So the only source we have that says that Dionysus is like, yeah, I'll just masturbate on his grave and it'll be great, is a Christian one that may have just been trying to make out the worship of Dionysus to be like silly and sexual and terrible. But to be fair, the worship of Dionysus was a little silly and sexual, at least by modern standards. There were lots of celebrations and ceremonies and different ways in which Dionysus was worshipped and celebrated. I'm choosing just to focus on one of the main ones that is a ritual from one of those mystery cults, as well as pretty much everyone in Athens during that classical Hellenistic period participated in, because I think it's interesting and I think it kind of reflects the themes that are evident in his mythology. So the mystery cults I've been referring to throughout this episode are more specifically known as the Eleusinian Mysteries, and as far as I can tell, they were called mysteries because they dealt with the mystery of the afterlife and the mystery of the soul, as well as they were just super mysterious because there was like lots of levels of initiation into what parts you could participate in for a lot of these things. So the Anthesteria is the 3-day ritual that was basically just a giant party that I'll be going over here, and it happened in mid-February by our calendar. It was primarily a celebration of the newly produced wine from last year coming to vintage. So like, wine's ready, let's go! I mean, there's lots of other stuff about like the afterlife and purifying yourself and making sure angry spirits and the ancestors were appeased. But, you know, wine! So day 1 of the Anthesteria was called the Pythoigia, which is translated to the Day of Crocks. And crocks is basically like, think of a wine barrel, but it's ceramic and buried in the ground. And these pythois were both where wine was fermented, and sometimes they were also used as caskets just because they were conveniently shaped and sized. Because of this connection to the burying of the dead, digging up the pythois to drink the wine out of them also supposedly brought up spirits from the underworld and roused Dionysus and the other gods of death. Because of this, before any people got to drink that fresh wine, some was poured out onto the ground, like in symbolic offering to Dionysus and the other gods of death. So not only did this first day of the Anthesteria kind of blur the lines between the living and the dead, summoning forth those dead spirits and gods associated with death, it also blurred the lines in like social hierarchy. Everybody got to drink the wine. The slaves drank the wine, the wives drank the wine, the children drank the wine. We were all drinking wine together, and no one cared what your social standing was. It was just a party. And because time is a concept, day 2 of the Anthesteria actually started on the night of day 1 in how we would think about it. So when the sun went down, that was the beginning of the next day in the ancient Greek worldview. So nighttime of day 1, things really get wild. So day 2 is called Chos, or either the day of pitchers, like a pitcher that pours wine, or the day of pollution was the translation I thought was more fun. So at the beginning of the night that marked the beginning of day 2, a procession was led from the city of Athens to the Dionysian temple out in the swamps, and this procession was led by women, and there was lots of dancing and singing and probably some phallic imagery used. And when they got out to the temple, a hierogamos was performed, and that means a ceremonial marriage, often involving a consummation. So this was the ceremonial marriage between a Dionysian priestess that was chosen as like a symbolic queen of Athens called the Athenian Bisalina, and the man chosen to ceremonially rule with her, the Archon Basilius, who was the mortal stand-in and representative of Dionysus for the purposes of this ceremony. The actual consummation part of events could have been a literal consummation where the Athenian Basilina and the Archon Basilinus had sex, or it could have been the Athenian Basilina used a figwood phallus as a symbolic consummation and sexual act with Dionysus, or it could have all just been symbolic and there was no actual sex. So we know what that symbolic king and queen were probably up to. But what about everybody else? Well, there was a bunch of women in the temple, and I quote from a source I have, participating in erotic events, and the men were basically just drinking and blowing a trumpet that was meant to summon Dionysus. So why does a human man, symbolically a god, and a human woman, symbolically a queen, need to have sex as part of worship about the afterlife and purification? Well, we're gonna have to dive back into mythology and history to understand what the fuck is going on here. So, human sacrifice is a thing that ancient humans did all over the world. And, you know, something you usually did when things were going bad. Like, man, didn't grow enough crops, not enough animals to kill. Better just kill a person, maybe that'll give the gods some incentive to give us sustenance. But sometimes, when things were real bad, you'd kill a king. King's worth a little more than your average Joe. But if you kill your king, who's your leader? So maybe if we just ceremonially pick a fake king every year that we treat good for the year and then kill him, maybe that'll be good enough to appease the gods. So we'll take this one more level, and what if there was a god that could go back and forth between life and death, that was super awesome and loved his worshippers and made sure they had plenty of wine, and he could volunteer to be the sacrifice? And Dionysus, he's your man. But how do you go about symbolically sacrificing a god? Well, there is another Dionysian myth in which his wife Ariadne is killed, and Dionysus again descends into the underworld and brings her back. It's good to be a woman in Dionysus' life. He's just not going to let you go. In fact, you're going to die immortal, and he's going to go rip you out from the bowels of hell and make you a goddess, because he's just the tits. So this pattern of Dionysus willing to go into the underworld, i.e. basically be dead for a little bit, to save a human and bring them back better, is kind of what this whole ceremonial marriage thing is about. So the guy that's supposedly possessed by Dionysus, that Archon Basilius, by marrying that ceremonial queen, it's symbolically representing Dionysus being willing to die and be reborn for all of the people that queen and the king that is him ceremonially are representing. Side note, God being willing to take on human form and die and be reborn for the purification of his worshippers. And does that sound familiar to anybody? It's kind of ringing some bells for me. Is that anyone else out there? No, just me? Anyway, on to day 3. Kai Troi, or the Day of Pots. Day 3 was supposed to represent a return back to normalcy. So, slaves aren't drinking with their masters anymore like on day 1, and the lines between living and dead and man and god aren't so blurred as they were on day 2. We're going back to the status quo. Turns out to get to the status quo, you still gotta do some weird shit though. First, some offerings of grains and seeds, dedicated to the death gods and the ancestors and spirits that had risen with the Pythoi on day 1, are spread around in naturally occurring fissures in the earth in the area. And then swings are set up over those wine barrels, Pythoi, so maidens can swing and play on them. This is a quote here. a symbolic enactment of life following death following life in rhythmic and apparently endless progression. Next time I'm on the playground, I'm going to be thinking deep. That's what I have to say there. So while the maidens are swinging, some specially chosen dudes called the Quirites would, again quote, purify the multitudes by scourging anyone they could catch with rawhide thongs soaked in water, after which the scourges and any lingering ancestral spirits would be symbolically chased away and banished from the city by the newly purified worshippers. Academic bullshit translation? Some yahoos with fucking whips would go around just trying to whip people, and if they caught you, you were kicked out of the city. Now I'm about to really blow your noggins with this fact. So, this ceremony with the whipping and the chasing is very similar to a ceremony in Rome called the Lupercalia, which happened in February, and the word February comes from the word for the leather thongs or whips that were used. So every time you think of the word February, know that that is named after a ceremonial whip and a just insane day of running around chasing people through the city with February whips. I don't even... what? But anyway, the city was purified. Dionysus' sacrifice was well worth it, and the death spirits had all been chased back to the underworld, and it was time to start the year anew with fresh wine. I hope you enjoyed that insane journey I just took you on, and can make some semblance of sense out of it, because yeah, I really barely can myself, but I just kept finding such like ridiculously fascinating things, and I wanted to talk about all of them. So we have a lot going on in this episode, and I hope you liked it. And I've got one little bonus mini myth for you if you want to stick around for it that I just couldn't figure out how to fit in anywhere in here. So now we're going to go on to King Midas and Dionysus. So this may actually be a familiar one for some of you. So Ariadne, that wife that I mentioned that Dionysus brought back from the dead, well, her father was King Midas of Crete. So a couple things about King Midas. His wife was Pasiphae, who was the mother of the Minotaur. So, you know, that's when Pasiphae cheated on Midas by getting fucked by a bull because the gods made her fall in love with the bull. But then Pasiphae and the bull's child turned out to be a man-eating monster called the Minotaur. So they stuck him in a labyrinth and fed Athenians to him. Yeah, just a really weird family tree we got going there. So Ariadne's father, King Midas, mom, Queen Pasiphae, brother, Minotaur, husband, Dionysus. And Dionysus was on pretty good terms with his father-in-law, King Midas. At one point, King Midas gave refuge to a friend of Dionysus, and in order to repay him, Dionysus was like, wish for whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. And Midas, with about as much forethought as his wife went into fucking a bull, asked that everything he touched be turned to gold. So he couldn't eat anything or drink anything or touch any of the people he loved, because all of those things just turned to gold. And he was like, you know, Dionysus, I take it back. I don't want to be this person. I don't want to be the gold toucher. And Dionysus was like, yeah, duh, you fucking idiot. Go wash yourself in the river Pactolus and everything will be fine. So that's what he did, rinsed his hands off nice and good in the river, and now everything that river touches turns to gold. Which is kind of true, actually. The river Pactolus, it's like Turkey-ish now. Its sands are known for being gold, and that's why, because Midas gave the river the power of the golden touch. And here I will again take some time to go over the sources I used to craft this episode, which were extensive, to say the least. I got way too into this, honestly. I read like 3 different books, one written by a neo-pagan that just got in like some excruciating detail about how these things worked, and some really deep philosophical shit that, my brain grew on this episode, my friends. It grew. And I went back and pulled my own notes on ancient Greece from like my freshman year of college. But you know, there's some good stuff in there. I wasn't as stupid as I expected myself to be, so that's good. And I pulled some from Herodotus, so that's like the oldest book of history ever, written basically during the time period that I'm talking about here, which is so awesome because it was like a learned man's perspective, like attempted objective perspective even, on Dionysus. And he talked a lot about how other cultures had very similar deities or even deities of the same name. And that was just fascinating because it was like Dionysus of Ethiopia, Dionysus of Libya, Dionysus of Thrace. And overall, I just had the most fun time researching for this episode. And I could have talked so much more about all this shit, but it would have got more confusing than it already is. So I tried to keep it a little narrowed down. But if you want to shoot me any questions or want me to tell you where you can learn more about all this crazy nonsense, hit me up because I would love to talk about it more. And then also, like I said, there was a lot of inconsistency about these different things in my sources, and I just did the best job I could trying to put together one cohesive narrative, both for the mythology and how the actual worship of Dionysus worked. But with all those inconsistencies, there's certainly things that I have said that some scholars will disagree with, just because you gotta pick a side at some point, just to tell a story that makes sense. I'm not saying the way I told it is necessarily the only way or the rightest way for all of these things. It's just the way that I could make the most sense for my purposes here. Anywho, stay silly, sexy, and sadistic only with consent.